Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Kim Nicholas, Professor of Sustainability Science at LUXUS, the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. And today we're going to talk about how to solve climate change. It's a very important and personal issue close to my heart. The last 3 years there have been devastating wildfires in California, where I grew up. In 2017, my family was evacuated. Thankfully, they were okay, but many friends lost their homes. Last year, the town of Paradise, California was devastated by wildfire. And just a few weeks ago, we had another wildfire in my home county of Sonoma again. So we know that warmer, drier conditions are contributing to and making these fires larger, more likely, and more damaging than they otherwise would be. This is just one impact of climate change that really drives home the urgency that we have to tackle this issue for me. Another is, of course, the youth climate strikes that we're seeing all over the world. Now millions of students and their supporters out on the streets demanding change, demanding a livable future, which they, of course, deserve. I was very lucky to be in Stockholm with some colleagues in September for the global climate strike at the end of September. And it was amazing to be on the street with 60,000 people who are advocating for the kinds of change that we need to actually stabilize the climate. What does that look like? What does climate science tell us we need to do? Well, what we know from decades and decades of study from thousands of scientists, which has been reviewed by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, boils down to a couple simple facts. We know that it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it. That's what these studies boil down to. And I've both distilled that into a teaching framework, this curriculum that looks at the elements of climate literacy, so starting with its climate, the basics of the physical climate system, but focusing especially on what we need to do to stabilize the climate. I think that's what's really relevant for us in the 21st century. I've also distilled these points down to a protest sign, which I first used in 2014 out on the streets with my students who invited me to join their climate protest. And it's been really heartening to see how that movement has grown over the last several years. So there's footnotes on the sign. You're welcome to look up on my website and look at the science and underlying evidence behind these points. But this really summarizes what we all need to know to act on climate. Talking about it's bad, we know that it's really bad, and we're already seeing the impacts sooner and closer to home than we thought we might. I was really devastated to listen last week to a talk by Kim Cobb, a coral reef scientist from the US, talking about her personal experience going back to a study site and seeing it decimated by a warming event during an El Nino warm event in the Pacific. And she talked about how seeing these sensitive ecosystems, which we've known for a long time, are right on the edge of climate sensitivity and an early warning sign of climate impacts on the biosphere. But she said, it's really heartbreaking to see these effects coming for these sensitive ecosystems. We are out of time, we are next. So we know the urgency with which we need to act to stabilize the climate. We have a policy in place. This is the Paris Agreement, adopted by all countries of the world, even if one in particular would like that to not be the case. It is the case that until at least 2020, all countries have agreed to this, and many are starting to put policies and practices in place to live up to it. We need to go much faster, but there is a lot actually already happening that's starting to work towards bending the curve. Basically, what the Paris Agreement says is our task in the 21st century, and really in the next decade, is to stabilize the climate and avoid dangerous climate change. And to do that, we need to stop adding pollutants of greenhouse gases, especially CO2, carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere. So that means we have agreed to hold global heating. The global average temperature should not warm more than 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. That's really important. We saw from the IPCC's report in 2018 what a big difference for people in nature that even ½ degree makes for so many species and vulnerable communities. So that 1.5 target is really important. To do that, we need to quickly peak global emissions. So we have to stop adding the pollutants to the atmosphere that are driving climate change and quickly head towards zero emissions. So not adding any more carbon to the atmosphere than what is taken out. So that's the challenge that we face before us. And of course, we need to do that in the context of equity and sustainable development. So I'm going to break down a little bit what that looks like and then talk with you about some pathways for doing that on different levels at the international level, but also in our daily lives and our communities and that we're a part of today. So first, this important need to balance sources and sinks. If we think of the atmosphere like a bathtub and the amount of greenhouse gases, for example, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that represents the concentration there, represents the level of the bathtub. In order to stabilize the climate, we have to stop adding more sources, more pollutants, like the tap from the sink, than what is taken out from the drain or sinks. So sources and sinks have to balance. This is what the Paris Agreement says. And the edge of the bathtub, that's our carbon budget. That's the amount we can safely emit and stay below these temperature targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees. It's really important to realize that we've used up almost all of our remaining carbon budget. Because carbon lasts for so long in the atmosphere, that's a budget for all of humanity for all of time. And in the last 40 years, we've used up almost half of the total that's been used to date. So we're using it up very quickly. There's very little left. And that's why it's so urgent that we act now to reduce emissions. So it's important to realize that stabilizing the climate at any temperature requires that we stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, especially carbon. As long as we're adding more carbon to the atmosphere, we're driving further warming. So it's not the case that we're at a new normal now, and this is now the new climate, this 1 degree warmer climate that we already live in. We're still adding a lot of carbon to the atmosphere, and that means we're still driving and committing to further changes and risks. Stabilizing the climate means we actually stop these sources of emissions at their origin. So that's mostly burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas for heating, electricity, and mobility. It's also livestock raising and other forms of agriculture. Right now, nature in the oceans and life on land is taking up about half of our climate pollution for us. So those natural sinks are really important to protect and restore. But we also have to realize we can't count on nature to completely solve our mess. As long as we have too much coming out of the faucet, nature is not going to be able to clean up for us after the fact. So while it's really critical to protect and restore ecosystems for many reasons, including helping stabilize the climate, it's important to do that quickly so that those ecosystems are healthy and are able to keep taking up carbon. But it's also important to actually get to the root of the problem and stop adding the carbon in the first place. The 1.5 degrees report from the IPCC in 2018 really brought home how urgent the situation is right now. This is a critical decade for stabilizing the climate. To have a chance at the 1.5 degrees target, we need to cut emissions at least in half in the next decade. And that's globally. So since most of the emissions come from high-emitting countries, a lot of the cuts need to come from us first. That's also outlined in the Paris Agreement on the basis of equity. We know that if we keep delaying, as we have been, we will miss the window. It will not be possible to meet the 1.5 degrees target if we wait another decade to get serious about emissions reductions. Right now, with current policies and pledges, we're on track for about 3 degrees of global heating, and that is a really scary world for me, one I really hope that we manage to avoid by actually taking action now. It has to be people who are alive today, so that means you and I, we, who are the ones to solve climate change. It's not going to be possible to keep pushing responsibility off to not even future generations, but future us, because we're talking about just the difference of a decade or two. But we know that emissions have to peak now. The Paris Agreement says as soon as possible, and science says for 1.5 to be possible, even for 2 degrees, we have to have reduced emissions about 20% by 2030. So peaking and emissions reductions have to be underway starting now. Let's look at those emissions. So what is it that has to peak exactly? Well, it's primarily burning fossil fuels. That's the source of carbon to the atmosphere. And carbon lives in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. So that's why it's so critical that we actually stop driving the source of this problem, because the carbon we add today is something we have to live with, not just for the rest of our lives, but for many, 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 many human generations into the future. That's why our carbon budget is so critical, and that we actually take care of what little remains. So you see here that coal, oil, and gas are the major sources of carbon to the atmosphere. 87% comes from fossil fuels. About 13% comes from agriculture and land use change, a lot of that driven by livestock grazing, especially for cows. So those are the sectors we need to look at and make changes in to stabilize the climate. As I said, emissions have to peak now and plummet to zero. Something that's quite depressing is that we've been putting this off for so long, we keep making the job harder for ourselves. And we just have to stop the delay and actually start the tough work of reducing emissions. We see that if we had started earlier, we would have had fewer emissions to reduce and could have been more gradual about it. Now, because we've delayed, the area under these curves is the same in all cases. So by delaying over the last decades, we've meant that we have more emissions to reduce and we have to do it more quickly. So this is really upsetting and it's a shame and it's unfair, but the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. We have to work with the world that we have and just start doing what's necessary in making these cuts. This slide from Glenn Peters shows that we've already emitted a lot of carbon. This area under the curve is a lot of CO2 that we can't go back and change history. And whether we want to stabilize the climate at 1.5 or 2 degrees, we just don't have much room left in the carbon budget. So if we want 1.5 and we don't count on taking out a lot of carbon from the atmosphere later through technologies that haven't been demonstrated at scale yet, or that might require a tremendous amount of land and other trade-offs, we have to really quickly plummet to zero. Even if we count on some of these technologies, which do have their own risks, we still have to get to zero. So the bottom line is we just have to stop burning fossil fuels. Looking at the sustainability aspect, so the Paris Agreement emphasizes the basis of equity and the context of sustainable development, efforts to eradicate poverty. The very first goal in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is zero poverty. So these are really important goals to strive for and to realize what we're actually aiming for in the 21st century is a good life for everyone and a thriving planet. This is the needle that we're trying to thread. So making the social changes that support a good life for everyone, reducing our overconsumption, benefiting and making access to the necessities for a good life for those who don't have it today, but living within the means of the planet. This graph shows the use of the total carbon budget. So if you look at, for example, on the top, the purple, let me point here, the two different purples basically, that's Europe and North America and Australia, who together have used almost half of the total carbon budget for all of humanity for all of time. So a small proportion of the population has enjoyed the benefits of burning fossil fuels and the development that has enabled. We now have to help figure out how to maintain a great quality of life with much less material consumption and zero fossil fuels, and help the rest of the world get there as well. That's the challenge that we face today. This study looked at data for countries across the world and basically showed that at the moment, we have a big challenge ahead of us because there is no country in the 21st century right now that is sustainable. And they define sustainable as living within this donut here, so this purplish reddish circle. The inner circle is the social threshold. Those are things like quality of life, life satisfaction, democratic quality, sanitation, food security, the necessities for a good life, both material needs being met and social welfare looked after. So some resources and environmental goods need to be consumed or used to secure those for everyone. The problem is at the moment, in many countries, high-income countries, we're consuming beyond this biophysical boundary. So we're in a state of ecological overconsumption or ecological debt. We're using far more of the Earth's resources than what is actually available. Meanwhile, so in countries like the US, that's the case where people are doing generally well, but nature is really suffering, and this is not possible to keep continuing. In poor countries like Sri Lanka, for example, right now material consumption is within planetary boundaries, so the biophysical boundaries are met here, but the problem is that people don't have basic needs met. They're falling far short on critical social needs. So what we're aiming for would be a life for everyone within this donut, a good life with social well-being and welfare without over-consuming natural resources. As I said, at the moment, this is we have a long ways to go to get there, because right now we have a situation where here on the x-axis you have these biophysical boundaries transgressed, and on the y-axis social boundaries transgressed. So what we want, achieved. What we want is 0 biophysical boundaries transgressed, living within the means of the planet, but all of the social well-being indicators met. And at the moment, there's no country on Earth that does that. We have a situation where we have mostly poor countries that live within the planet's means, but don't meet people's needs. And through economic development, it tends to be that social welfare tends to increase, but at a totally unsustainable rate for the planet. So basically, we need a new model of progress and development for the 21st century. We have to be focused on securing protection and well-being for people and nature in a way that can be sustained into the future. The current system really isn't working, because we have a system where if we look at the population on Earth of about 7.5 billion now, but we round that to 7 and say about 1 billion people here live on what Hans Rosling calls level 1. So that's extreme poverty, where basic needs are not met. Clean water, food, security are not available. And this is an urgent priority for development. Most people on Earth live in level 2, which is on average the level of India, or level 3, which is the average level of China. So a big increase in welfare and well-being and health, life expectancy, other indicators from having basic needs met, having, for example, access to clean water makes a huge difference, of course. About 1 billion people live on level 4, which is above $32 per day, so less than $1,000 a month. But that is a rare condition actually on planet Earth. So we have to think about these problems with equity and ways that can both live within the planet's means and address these equity issues. So that's why I propose these 3 principles for the 21st century. This is what I think we need to focus on to navigate the challenges ahead and have a good life for everyone on Earth. First, we need to focus on the point. That's protecting people and nature, ensuring a good life for everyone alive today, the possibility for a good life for everyone who's coming in the future, while maintaining Earth's life support system and the amazing and miraculous diversity of life on Earth. That's what we need to be focused on in our policies and practices. We can do that through 2 things. Through first reducing harm, so stopping harm at its source. Right now we know our emissions of fossil fuels and other sources of carbon are causing a tremendous amount of harm. So we need to get to the root cause of that harm and stop it at its source. Thirdly, we need to increase resilience. So make our communities and ecosystems able to withstand the stresses that a warmer planet inflicts, and better connect with each other and with nature so that we can be prepared for and adapt to the changes that are already underway. It's really important that we adapt to the changes we can't avoid, but avoid the changes that we can't adapt to. So what does that look like in practice? Well, at the moment, we're transferring a lot of carbon from the geological sphere, so from fossil fuels that have been buried for 400 million years, to the atmosphere. And that is the root cause of our problem today. So step 1 and an absolute necessity for solving climate change is to stop burning fossil fuels like our lives depend on it, which they do. Our ability to have a good life on planet Earth really depends on us stabilizing the climate. And to do that, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Secondly, we need to stop destroying nature like our lives depend on it, which they do. We do not exist and cannot exist without nature. Even if we live these highly technological lives, even if we spend most of our time in cities, all of the materials and all of the resources that we depend on ultimately come from nature. To keep us alive, we need healthy nature. And it's pretty amazing that this is the only place in the known universe where life exists. I think it's really important to protect it. So now we get on to, okay, where do we go to look at the root causes of climate change? What changes can we make to actually bring about, to live out these principles of the 21st century to actually stabilize the climate? Well, when we look at the emissions chain, we see that actually it's all connected. We have a relatively small number of large companies that extract and distribute fossil fuels. So that's the beginning of the chain. But then those fossil fuels and land use changes go towards sectors and ultimately households are the main consumers of these goods. So I think we need to think on all levels, both on the supply side, on certainly stopping building and expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, making plans to shut down rather than expand this infrastructure, making transition plans, both financial and practical, for getting off of fossil fuels, but also reducing demand, getting away from consuming products and sectors that are very fossil intensive. Those are both going to be important strategies. When we look at who's causing these emissions, if we break down household emissions by these 4 levels that I showed you earlier, we see a pattern that's common again and again in looking at climate impacts or in climate causes, which is disproportionate distribution. So the richest 10% here cause about 36% of total climate pollution. That's most people in OECD countries, for example. And the bottom 50% together cause only about 15% of the total emissions. So the point is, poor people don't emit very much. They can't do much to reduce their emissions. In fact, they may need to increase them slightly to meet their basic needs and have a decent standard of living. So it's primarily in countries and for individuals who have the means to be emitting a lot today where we need to make the biggest changes the fastest and reduce our emissions. Now, exactly where we focus, exactly where we start, remember, to stabilize the climate, all emissions have to go to 0. So that means every country, every sector, every individual, ultimately, we have to stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. That needs a lot of change, and a lot of support can happen on basically any level. So I'm kind of agnostic about which level to start on. I think it depends on where you personally have the best leverage, the most contacts, the most inspiration. Please just recognize that we need change on all of these levels, and having people working on all of them is really important to actually make this transition happen fast enough to stabilize the climate in a good time. So that could be on a local level with friends and family in your own household. That could be on a city level, so local politics and communities. That could be on a business level, where many businesses are starting to lead. Science-based targets is one example I show here. That could be on a system or political level. So all of these changes are important and help reinforce each other. So I'll just now give you some examples of how to make high-impact changes on those different levels. I'll start with the individual level. This was work that was led by Seth Wines, who did his master's thesis with us here in Lund. And it arose because Seth used to be a high school science teacher, and his students would ask him, what are the things that I personally can do? What really makes a difference for me in my daily life in terms of climate change? So we wanted a good science-based answer to that question. Seth assembled 39 different sources, mostly from the peer-reviewed literature, but also looking at carbon calculators and other estimates. And what we came to is this: when you take a life cycle perspective and look at emissions today under the situation that we have in high-emitting and highly developed countries, there are 4 choices that individuals can make that make a huge difference for the climate. The most urgent are the near-term ones, and that's living car, flight, and meat-free. Those are the highest impact choices for the climate. In the long term, family size also plays a role. So let's look at how that breaks down. We know that we're very close to spending all of our carbon budget. And if we want to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees, we have a carbon budget of 2.5 tons per person per year already by 2030. So that is dramatically lower, maybe 80 or more % lower than emissions in many high-income countries today. That would be a big change. That's the target we're aiming for. We know that today, for example, just one flight across the Atlantic from New York to London and back uses about 2/3 of that sustainable budget. So flight is one of the highest emitting activities, and that's why flight-free is one of the highest impact climate actions. Especially for frequent flyers, it's likely that flying is the biggest part of your carbon footprint and a really important source to cut down. The other actions that we saw were living car-free. Cars, we found on average emit about 2.4 tons per person per year. So reducing car use was a very high impact action. And a plant-based diet was consistently another high impact action. That because plants use so much less land, energy, and water to grow rather than animals that both emit a lot of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, and also tend, in the way they're raised now, use a lot of resources. So these are the daily choices for mobility, food, and energy that save emissions today. And those are really important areas to focus on. There's a lot of movement happening in the Flight Free movement, for example, people pledging to stay on the ground for a year as part of Flight Free 2020 and other campaigns, or making pledges to dramatically reduce their flying where they can't eliminate it. Going car free is also becoming more and more popular, finding ways to reduce car use for those who do depend on a car, whether it's carpooling or other creative solutions. Just driving less is a really critical one. And the plant-based diet also plays a really big role. This last bar here had a really big effect, and that's over the long term, creating a new person under today's high emissions lifestyles has a very long-term carbon legacy. So taking this lifestyle effect meant that, life cycle approach meant that when we looked at the carbon impact of choosing to have a child, that impact plays out over many generations. So in the long term, it's a really big climate impact to create a new person. Of course, this is a personal choice and something we hope informs people in making this very personal choice. But it's also important to realize that that choice is not what will determine the future of the climate in the near term. Because we're so close to the limit of our carbon budget now, we have to reduce today's emissions. And the fastest way to do that for individuals is through flying, driving, and meat eating, eliminating or substantially reducing those. I can recommend this carbon calculator among others. UC Berkeley also has a good one, but I think this one from Sitra, a future fund in Finland, is well adapted to Scandinavian and I think other European conditions, and offers some really helpful ways of how to assess what you're doing now and what the most high impact and most feasible ways would be to reduce personal emissions. Okay, then we come to the role of high consuming individuals. And we see this, I'll talk more about universities. I think universities have a special responsibility and role to play in the climate transition to a safe climate. But again, here we see this trend that in a study led by Seth Wines and Simon Donner at UBC, the University of British Columbia, they found that a very small percentage of people were responsible for most of the emissions, in this case from flying. So in their sample, about a third of the people studied didn't fly at all during the study period, but about 8% produced almost half of the flight emissions. 25% produced 80% of emissions. So to reduce emissions at their source, we have to look at who is producing the emissions and find ways to reduce those. Again, for taking these categories of personal or household emissions, this can look quite different than the global scale, so it's important that we focus our energy where it makes the biggest difference. For high-income individuals, it's often the case, especially for frequent flyers, that flying is by far the largest part of an individual or a household's carbon budget. So that is the biggest possibility to reduce. You see here on the scale, this was for the case of a high-income household of 2 people. And together, their combined emissions were incredibly high. I think it was 120, so around 60 tons per person per year. That was more than 3 times the current US average, much higher than the global average of 4 to 5 tons per person per year. They're consuming that much already just in their motor vehicle use, for example, and way more than that in just their flying habits. So here from our study are the high impact actions that reduce emissions in these areas, the highest impact being going car-free, a plant-based diet, and avoiding flying. Some colleagues here at Lund University have created a museum from the future called Carbon Ruins. So it's set in 2053, and it looks back on the fossil fuel era, which by then has concluded. And it's looking at how did we manage to make this transition. And one of the things that's in that museum is my frequent flyer card. So I quit flying within Europe in 2012. I'm working towards being flight free. I took a sailing course this past summer with my husband, and we're working on a transatlantic sail to visit family in the next few years in North America. But at the moment, I've gone more than 90% reduction in my flights. And I think this is something we need to consider, is finding ways to meet family, to meet friends, enjoy travel and adventure without flying. There are many possibilities to do this, but I think if we're going to stabilize the climate, we need to have frequent flyer cards in a museum. I mentioned the special responsibility for universities. This is something we're seeing in Sweden. Lund University's mission is to understand, explain, and improve the world and the human condition. And I think universities, given that mission, have a special responsibility as both creators of knowledge, as educators of students, as actors in society where we're trying to inform public discussions with the best available evidence. If we can't lead this transition, who do we expect to do it for us? So I think as universities, we really need to be out front in reducing our own emissions and helping put our own research into practice, in collaborating with others and actually making this transformation happen. I've had colleagues here in Sweden who have led an op-ed, an editorial in a newspaper last year calling for Sweden to universities to cut our emissions in half in the next 4 years now. This was helped inspire a petition by students signed by over 6,000, I believe, Lund University students. I have to update my slide there, sorry. Who agree and who are putting forward their own demands for a university in line with a safe climate, which they certainly deserve. So I think both responding to the mandate of a university and from our colleagues and students, universities could really be out in front. Sweden has created a climate strategy framework that almost all of the major universities in the country have signed up to. And what it says, among other things, is that we will reduce our own emissions to be in line with 1.5 degrees. Well, we know that globally this means more than cutting in half of emissions by 2030. And since we are high emitters and have a lot of possibilities to reduce, from an equity perspective, we should be going even faster than that. So I'm working together with colleagues to try and help make this happen at Lund University and push funders and others in the Swedish academic landscape to support this work. I hope that others will also do the same. And I've been really inspired by people in the Academics Flying Less movement. I know in Switzerland and Germany and elsewhere, in the UK, there are many, many people who are also working on this. So there's quite a lot of community to be had there. Something that I was really gratified to see was that our department, Luxus, adopted this flying less policy almost a year ago, December 2018. We've had a lot of interest and uptake from colleagues around the world who are designing their own policies. Basically, we're using a Paris-like approach where we have a pledge and review system. So each of us assesses for ourselves what an ambitious goal would be relative to our baseline and capabilities, and put that into writing. It's reviewed at our annual meeting with our director. So coming up in January, we'll have our first year of data and see how we're doing. So I hope I can report some positive news on that soon. In the meantime, there's lots of information out there on best practices for reducing flying for universities. That tends to be a very high part of our carbon footprint. Here at Lund University, more than 90% of the emissions that we report to the government come from flying, actually. We're already using 100% renewable energy, and the other major source that we report is from car traffic, so commutes to work and so on, but that ends up being less than 5%. So to reduce emissions, we have to look at the source, and for universities, flying is a really major source of emissions. So some simple strategies to get started there. Having a travel-free meeting policy, supporting digital meetings. Thank you to the hosts for helping record this and allow me to participate virtually. I think it's a great example. Economy class tickets only when flying does happen. That's business or first class tickets pollute much more because they take up more space on the plane. Automating emissions accounting, so having a system that keeps track of emissions and allows monitoring automatically is something really important. And then an internal emissions fund. So putting essentially a higher price on high polluting activities, like if a plane ticket does get bought, making it more expensive and putting that money to use to reduce the university's emissions or support another cause locally to actually, not to offset, but to prevent and reduce emissions elsewhere is really important. And then a behavioral incentives program, so communicating to people what the effects are and having a way to track and monitor them. That was looking at the institutional level for reducing emissions from travel. Another important area is food. Something that we've done here is to make vegetarian food the default or the norm in our catering and parties and events that we sponsor. And that's something we started in our department that's spreading more and more, and I'm seeing more and more take up by colleagues. We know that we can't meet the 2-degree target with current Western diets. Estimates range by about 80 to 90% less, especially red meat or beef consumption, needed to meet climate targets. So we have to substantially reduce, if not eliminate, the consumption of those products. I think it's very important to, again, be leading by example and practicing what we preach in our research, actually in our daily lives. So that's something we're pushing for more broadly at Lund University. Students have also asked for more and better vegetarian options as a both climate and health strategy. Again, as universities, many of us have teaching roles, and that's something really important in how we communicate and convey to students both the urgency and the solutions to the climate crisis. Again, Seth Wines, who, as part of his work here, developed some teaching materials for high school students to translate these high-impact actions to teaching lessons for secondary school students. Those are available if you're interested, and you're very welcome to use them. But I think in general, we also have that climate curriculum with the 5 things everyone needs to know. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can't fix it. It's very important to convey those to students and to have accurate and up-to-date materials. Looking now to start wrapping up at the system level, we know that there's just not room in the carbon budget to keep building fossil fuel infrastructure. And in fact, there was a new study from Steve Davis and colleagues that came out in 2019 showing we'll need to shut down existing infrastructure early if we want to meet the 1.5 degree goal. So that means coal-fired power plants and other fossil-intensive infrastructure needs to be retired ahead of schedule in order to make our climate goals. So we need to be planning for that. It's completely suicidal to be expanding carbon-based infrastructure at this point. Some of my students were part of this protest, which was at Europe's largest coal mine. Europe's 10 largest sources of CO2 are now 9 coal-fired power plants and Ryanair, the low-cost airline. So expansion of these kind of fossil-intensive industries is absolutely the wrong direction in terms of stabilizing the climate. And that means we need to be thinking and planning both financially and practically for how to have a just transition for the workers in these industries, both from a fairness and equity point of view, that people have jobs and a decent living, and from a political point of view, so that these transition policies that actually enable a fair and fast transition away from fossil fuels are politically accepted and not resisted. And we know from social science reviewed by the IPCC, people need to understand the seriousness of the impacts of climate change and the potential risks, and feel that the proposed solutions are fair, both in the process and in how they're distributed. So those are the kind of questions we need to be tackling in designing climate policy. Another system-level change, legal cases, especially led by young people, are having a big effect and starting to hold polluters to account and not allow the continuation of destruction of the climate and the biosphere that we and coming generations need for a safe and stable life. So I'm very encouraged by some of these cases going forward. There are more and more happening every day, and I think this is one system, one route to the kind of system change that we need to see. And then finally, I'll say the last thing I think we need to do at the system level is listen to young people. They are increasingly speaking up with a loud and clear voice, asking us to listen to the science, asking us to follow the terms of the Paris Agreement, which we've already agreed to do. Many countries already have laws on the books saying they will do that. But right now, we know we're not doing enough to live up to those commitments, and we absolutely have to do it if we're going to stabilize the climate and have a safe climate future. So I hope I've given you some ideas for ways that we can participate in that, you personally, whether it's starting with your own life at home, your colleagues and community where you live or work, at the political level, all of these changes are really important. All of them are necessary. And I hope that we can look back on the concluded fossil fuel era and from a point of view of a stabilized climate in a few decades. I think we can do it. Thank you.